Good morning. On the second Sunday of Easter, we're concluding our reading of John's Gospel. And one of the characteristics that distinguish John's Gospel is that beyond the retelling of events, there's usually a deeper meaning to be found in the particular stories he shares or in the way that he depicts them. In today's reading, we see what John identifies as the third time after Christ's resurrection that Jesus appears to those John calls the 11, which are the 12 apostles without Judas. In his resurrection account, John says that Jesus appeared to many of his disciples and did many works among them. But he focuses on the first three appearances Jesus makes to the apostles. And I'd like to look at all three encounters briefly, as each encounter the apostles have with Christ demonstrates something about the nature of new life in him. And I would emphasize new life in Christ rather than just resurrection, because we've seen resurrection before in the Gospels, in the story of Lazarus being brought back to life. Presumably, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus resumed the life he was living before. He reunited with his family. He continued whatever occupation he had, and he died a natural death. What we're seeing here is that the nature of Jesus' resurrection is not like that of Lazarus's. Jesus did not appear to them in order to continue walking and living amongst them as he did before. Rather, each time he appears, he adds to the foundation necessary for them to fulfill the ministry that he has begun and to which he first called them. In Jesus' encounters with the disciples, we're being shown that Christ's resurrection is ultimately about initiating new life in a new kingdom. In each of these encounters, Christ both heals something within the apostles and gifts them with something. He heals them from something inhibiting their new life in him and gifts them with something needed for their new life in his kingdom. The first person who sees Christ in his resurrected state is Mary Magdalene. She first tells the apostles that his body is missing, and then she tells them that he has risen from the dead and has spoken with her. But despite this amazing news, that evening they were locked in together, hiding in fear of the religious authorities. Even though they had been given this word that Christ was alive, they were afraid. They weren't joyful. They weren't happy. They weren't out sharing this good news. Their response was fear, perhaps because they thought that the authorities would come after them, insisting that they had stolen the body and that they would continue with the ministry that had run afoul of the religious leaders in the first place. The reason that Jesus was crucified at all was because of the religious leaders. And just as Peter denied Christ in fear of suffering the same, and just as the disciples scattered in fear, they are now, even hearing the good news of Christ's resurrection, afraid, fearful of their own suffering. What does resurrection mean in word if all they've seen is their Lord crucified and a missing body? They've heard the word, but it is not yet good news to them. And as they are in this state, Jesus appears to them for the first time. And the first thing he does is heal them of this fear and anxiety. He says, "Peace be with you." He heals them by speaking peace into their hearts. They can be at peace because he has not come to them to condemn them for their doubt. He has not come to them to condemn them for abandoning him. He had forgiven them on the cross. Now he has come to call them to continue the ministry he began before he was crucified. And he gifts them with the promise of spiritual power and authority to bring God's peace to others, saying, "If you forgive the sins of any, they will be forgiven." And from this point forward, we do not see the apostles in hiding. In this encounter, Christ establishes peace over fear, enabling us to experience joy and closeness with God, overcoming the uncertainty within us and around us. A week passes before the Lord appears to the apostles again, and this time there is healing for a particular person who we know as Doubting Thomas. Thomas, not having been present when Christ appeared the first time, did not believe the word of the apostles that Christ was alive. I suppose in the same way that the apostles had not believed Mary Magdalene. And not only had Thomas not believed, but he refused to believe until he had seen it for himself. And so Jesus comes and he heals Thomas's doubt. He allows Thomas to touch his hands and to touch his side to know that he is real. And he gifts them with faith and a blessing for all of those who, unlike the apostles, have not pressed their hands into Christ's side and yet believe the word that is preached. This blessing is necessary, for it lays the foundation for the work Jesus would call the apostles to do. For their preaching could bear no fruit if no one believed without first seeing. And as Christian tradition has told it, Thomas would take the gospel to India to establish the Christian faith there. And so, in this second encounter, Jesus establishes faith over doubt, enabling the preaching of the gospel to bear fruit. And finally, we come to the encounter in today's reading, in which the apostles are living in this liminal space. They know their Lord has risen from the dead. They know that he has spoken peace to them. He has promised them the ability to bring others to peace with God through the forgiveness of sins. He has exhorted them to have faith and spoken a blessing over all of those who, like us, would ultimately exercise faith through their preaching. And yet, the apostles have not yet been sent out. And so, what is there for them to do other than what they have always done, which is to go fishing? That's what they know. And they spend all night attempting to catch fish, but they're completely unsuccessful. And Jesus comes and he's a football field's length away, so they can't tell that it's him. And he calls to them to tell them to just put the net on the other side. And they must have been desperate to try this, because why should this have made any difference? But when they change sides, the net is teeming with fish. And this is clearly miraculous. And it speaks to what Jesus told them when he first called them to follow him. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. So in this catch of fish, Jesus shows up as they have returned to their former vocation, showed up when there's no fruit in their labor, and says, just listen to me, follow my word, and your nets will be teeming with fish, which, as he told them at the start, really symbolizes people. Listen to my word, follow my instruction, and I will turn your fruitless labor into abundance in bringing people into my fold. When they arrive at the shore and Jesus has prepared breakfast for them, Jesus has to speak specifically to Peter. Because in Peter's denial of Christ before Gethsemane, Peter had denied his calling and purpose. The Lord asks Peter to reaffirm his love for him, and then tells him, feed my sheep, tend my sheep. Jesus comes and heals Peter's purposelessness by calling him to be a shepherd of Christ's flock. Where Peter had previously shirked back from suffering with Christ, he now sets Peter on a path to offer up his very life in following him. He gifts Peter and the apostles with a new vocation, which is the Great Commission. In this third encounter, Christ establishes purpose over purposelessness, directing those who are called by him toward the building up of his kingdom. And so, and looking at these encounters, we see again that it is not the extension of our natural lives that Christ's resurrection brings, but rather a new life. He is our forerunner, trailblazing a path into a new life in a new kingdom. Having risen in him, he says to us, as he said to his disciples, "Follow me." And so in this Easter season, we follow Christ into new life. We follow Christ into peace. We follow Christ into spiritual power and authority. We follow Christ into faith. We follow Christ into a life of purpose in his kingdom. Amen.